My daughter told me not to wear my work clothes to her wedding. She said it nicely, the way she always did when she wanted to control something without looking like she was controlling it. Dad, I just want everything to look cohesive. You understand, right? I understood perfectly. My name is Arthur Doyle. I'm 59 years old. For 31 years, I welded structural steel for a living. Bridges, high-rises, industrial plants. I worked in the heat, in the cold, on elevated platforms with nothing but a harness between me and the ground. And for most of those 31 years, my daughter was embarrassed to tell people what I did. She got her chance to fix that embarrassment at her own wedding. What she didn't count on was what happened when her new father-in-law asked me a simple question across the dinner table. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we actually got here. My wife Diane and I raised 2 kids in Akron, Ohio. My daughter Paige is 28. My son Marcus is 25. Diane was a school administrator. Good salary, good benefits, respected job title. Me, I was the guy who left before sunrise and came home smelling like metal and smoke. Diane never complained about that. The kids did, eventually. It didn't start with Paige. It started with her friends. She was maybe 15 when I noticed the pattern. I'd pick her up from school sometimes, still in my work gear. Carhartt jacket, steel-toed boots, the faint smell of welding flux no matter how many times I washed my hands. Her friends would pile into the car, and I'd watch Paige in the rearview mirror. She'd smile too wide, laugh too quickly, fill every silence before anyone could ask what her dad did for work. One afternoon, I heard her through her bedroom door. A friend had asked. My dad does contracting, she said. Like industrial stuff. It's kind of complicated to explain. I stood in the hallway for a second. Then I went downstairs and made dinner. That's the thing about being a quiet person. You file things away. You don't explode. You don't confront. You just note it, folder it, and keep moving. I had a lot of folders by the time Paige was in her 20s. She went to Ohio State, studied communications, graduated with honors, got a job at a marketing firm in Columbus, met a man named Brendan whose father was a cardiologist in Westerville. The first time I met Brendan's parents, his father Douglas and his mother Patricia, dinner was at a restaurant where the menu had no prices on the guest side. Diane squeezed my hand under the table. Douglas asked what I did. Before I could answer, Paige said, Dad's in the trades, industrial work. Then she pivoted to asking Patricia about their trip to Portugal. Douglas looked at me. I looked at him. He nodded slowly. I nodded back. Marcus was different from Paige. Quieter, less polished, more interested in video games than appearances. But he had his moments. When he was in college, he told his roommate I worked for a manufacturing company. Which was technically true. I did work for one, as their primary structural welding contractor. But he left that part out. The moment I remember clearest happened maybe 4 years ago. Marcus needed help with his rent. His college stipend had run short, and he called me on a Wednesday evening. Dad, I hate to ask, but I'm kind of stuck. I told him to give me his account number. $1,200, transferred within the hour. He thanked me, paused, and said, I don't know how you always have money. I thought... He stopped himself. Never mind. Thanks, Dad. He thought what? That I was scraping by? That a man who'd spent 3 decades welding critical infrastructure for some of the largest construction firms in the Midwest was somehow broke? Neither of my kids had ever asked what I made. Never once. Diane knew. She'd always known. But somewhere in the last decade, Diane had also started pulling away from what I was. Not cruelly. She was never cruel. But she started describing me to new acquaintances the same way the kids did. Arthur works in industrial construction, as if the specifics were somehow beneath mention. I started to understand something around the time Paige got engaged. This family had built a story about me, and they'd all agreed to tell it. I was background. Necessary, stable, present. But not the kind of present you'd put in the foreground of a photo. Here's what none of them knew. In 2007, I started a side operation out of our garage. Small stuff at first. Custom metalwork, ornamental railings, a gate here, a staircase there. But I had a skill, and more importantly, I had a network. 30 years of showing up on job sites, doing good work, being reliable. That builds something. What it built for me specifically was a list of project managers and general contractors who called me first when they needed specialty welding that their crews couldn't handle. By 2012, I had registered Doyle Structural Services, LLC, in the state of Ohio. By 2015, I had 3 full-time employees and a shop. By 2019, I had 11 employees, equipment worth more than most people's houses, and contracts with 4 general contractors across northeastern Ohio. My shop and stow handled everything from structural repair to custom fabrication for commercial developers, and never talked about it at home. Not because I was hiding it. I told Diane in 2012 when I registered the LLC. She said, "That's nice, Arthur." Then she went back to grading papers. In 2017, I told her the business had cleared $400,000 in gross revenue for the year. She said, "Be careful with taxes." That was the extent of her engagement. So I stopped bringing it up. I kept a separate business account, filed separately for the business, and ran everything through my accountant, a guy named Phil who had been doing my books since the garage days. Phil knew exactly what Doyle Structural Services was worth. Nobody else in my family had ever asked. The wedding was scheduled for June, on a Saturday, at a venue outside Columbus. Brendan's family was paying for most of it. That was fine. Douglas had made it clear, politely but unmistakably, that they wanted it done a certain way. About 6 weeks before the wedding, Paige called me. We were talking logistics, who was sitting where, what time rehearsal dinner started, and then she said it. "Dad, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about the dress code. It's black tie optional. And I know you have like a nice blazer, but Brendan's family is pretty formal. Maybe it would be worth buying an actual suit? Something fitted?" I own 3 suits. I've owned suits since before Paige was born. But I didn't say that. "I'll make sure I look right," I told her. "I just don't want you to feel out of place," she said. That was the tell. She wasn't worried about me feeling out of place. She was worried about herself. 3 weeks before the wedding, I had lunch with my shop foreman, a man named Curtis who'd been with me for 9 years. I told him what was happening. He stirred his coffee and said, "You ever just gonna tell them, Arthur?" I shrugged. He shook his head. "You let people write a story about you long enough, they start believing it's yours." I thought about that for a while. The week before the wedding, Douglas called me. He said he wanted to connect before the big day, maybe grab coffee. I liked Douglas. He was direct. We met at a place near his office and talked for an hour about football, about Brendan growing up, about what retirement looked like. He asked about my work, not in the way my family asked, deflecting, minimizing, but straight. "What do you do exactly?" I told him. All of it. He put his coffee down. "You're running a structural fabrication company." He said it back to me like a confirmation, not a question. 11 employees, I said. "We're in the middle of a contract right now for a distribution center up in Medina." "And your daughter told my wife you were a welder," he said. "I am a welder," I said. "I'm also the guy who signs the paychecks." He laughed. Not a polished laugh, a real one. The wedding day was beautiful. The venue was an old estate with a barn conversion, string lights, good weather. Diane cried during the ceremony. I handed her my pocket square and kept my face neutral. Paige looked genuinely happy. Whatever else was complicated about our relationship, in that moment she was just my daughter getting married, and I was glad she was glad. The reception was where things shifted. We were at the head family table, me, Diane, Paige, and Brendan. Douglas and Patricia. Cocktail hour was wrapping up, dinner was being served, and the conversation was doing that polite circling thing that happens when two families don't quite know each other yet. Patricia was lovely. Douglas was engaged. Diane was warm in the way she got warm, and she was slightly nervous. Then Douglas leaned across the table during a lull. He had that look, the look of a man who had been waiting to ask something. "Arthur, I have to say, I had a very interesting conversation with you last week. I did some reading after." Paige looked up from her plate. "Reading?" Brendan asked. "Your father-in-law's company," Douglas said pleasantly, "has done structural work on some significant projects in this region." He looked at me. "The Medina Distribution Center. That's the Cardinal Logistics facility, isn't it?" "That's the one," I said. "That's a $30 million development," Douglas said. "To the table, not to me. Just factually." Paige set down her fork. Diane looked at me. "Dad," Paige said slowly. "What is he talking about?" I took a sip of water. "I have a fabrication business. Doyle Structural Services. We handle specialty welding and structural work for commercial construction projects." "Since when?" "Since 2007. The silence at the table had a texture to it. Brendan looked at his father. "Dad, how did you know this?" "Arthur told me when we had coffee," Douglas said. "I assumed everyone knew." "I told your mother in 2012, I said to Paige, calmly, not as an attack, just as a fact. She knew." Diane's face did something complicated. "You mentioned it. I didn't realize the scope." "How big is the company?" Paige asked. Her voice was careful. "We billed about $2.3 million last year," I said. "Good year. 11 employees, including my shop foreman Curtis, who's been with me since the early days." Brennan let out a low breath. "Not rude. Just surprised." "2.3 million, Paige repeated. "Gross revenue," I said. "Net's different, but the business is healthy." Patricia reached over and touched Douglas's arm. She was smiling but watching Paige the way mothers watch their children when something important is happening. "Paige," I said, "I've been doing this work your whole life. I just never led with it. Why not?" The question came out smaller than she probably intended. "Because you never asked," I said. "You introduced me as, 'My dad does industrial stuff,' and moved on. I figured that's where you wanted to leave it." She looked like she'd been handed something she didn't know how to hold. "I didn't know," she said. "I know you didn't," I said. "That part's on both of us." Douglas cleared his throat gently and shifted the conversation toward the food, the venue, something about the drive from Westerville. He was a man who understood timing. I appreciated that, but the night wasn't over. During dessert, one of Brendan's cousins, a young guy, maybe 23, few drinks in, wandered over and asked if I was Paige's dad. I said yes. He said he'd overheard something about my company. Was that true? I confirmed it was. He said, "Dude, that's actually sick. My buddy's a welder. People don't realize how much skill that takes." I liked that kid immediately. It was later, after the cake and the toasts, when Paige found me outside in the venue's patio. The string lights were still going. Music coming from inside. She had her shoes off, carrying them in one hand. She looked like herself. Not the managed, composed version, just Paige. "Can we talk?" she said. "We can always talk," I said. She stood there for a moment without starting. I waited. I've always been good at waiting. "I've been doing something unfair to you," she said finally, "for a long time." "I know." I was embarrassed. She said it plainly. "Not of you exactly. More of, I don't know, what people would think. Brendan's family, my colleagues. I built this image of myself, and I was afraid your job didn't fit in it." I looked at her, my daughter in her wedding dress standing barefoot on a patio, being honest with me. "Your job didn't fit your image," I said. "But I did." She looked at me. What? I always fit, I said. You just kept me in a room nobody saw. She didn't say anything for a while. Then, I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. I believed her. That's the thing about Paige. When she's genuine, you can feel it. She's not always genuine, but when she is, it's real. I know, I said. I'm not angry. Are you sure? Because you had every right to be. Oh, I was angry, I said. For a while, but anger is expensive and I got better things to spend on. She laughed. A real one. The suit looks good, by the way, she said. It's a $900 suit, I said. I've had it since 2018. I just hadn't worn it around you before. She laughed again, and this time she leaned into me a little, and I put my arm around her shoulders, and we stood there while the music played inside. That was June. By August, things had changed in ways I hadn't entirely predicted. Diane came to me about 3 weeks after the wedding. We were in the kitchen, a Sunday morning, coffee going. She sat down across from me and said, I owe you an apology, Arthur. I looked at her. Douglas called me, she said. After the wedding. He told me what you two talked about over coffee. He was very kind about it. But he also made it clear that he found it strange that I didn't seem to know the full picture of what you'd built. She paused. And he was right. I didn't. I told you in 2012, I said. You mentioned it, she said. I didn't listen. I didn't ask. And then you stopped telling me. And I let that happen, and that's on me. She looked at her coffee cup. I spent a lot of years treating what you did like it was smaller than it was. You and the kids both, I said. The kids got it from somewhere, she said quietly. That hit, but it was honest, and I respected it. What do you want to do with that? I asked her. I want to understand, she said. I want to actually know what you've built. If you're willing to show me. I took her to the shop that Tuesday, showed her the floor, the equipment, introduced her to Curtis and the guys. She asked questions, real ones, not polite ones. How did you get the first contract? What's the margin on a job like that? What happens if a client doesn't pay? She was a school administrator. She understood organizational systems. When she saw how the operation ran, I watched something change in her face. You built this by yourself, she said, standing in the middle of the shop floor. Mostly, I said. Curtis helped. Curtis waved from across the floor without looking up from what he was working on. Arthur, she said. I'm sorry I wasn't paying attention. Marcus was different. His reckoning came later and more awkwardly. He called me in September, some problem with his apartment lease. Wanted to know if I could co-sign something. I told him I could, and then I told him he should probably know some things about my financial situation before he assumed what I was and wasn't capable of handling. I kept it simple. Told him about the business, the revenue, the trajectory, the number of years it had been running while he'd been telling people his dad worked for a manufacturing company. There was a long silence. Then, Dad, why didn't you ever say anything? You never asked, I said, for the second time in 3 months. That's fair, he said. Then, I told my girlfriend's parents who were semi-retired from construction. Marcus. I know. Another pause. Dad, I'm sorry. That was a messed up thing to do. Yeah, I said. It was. Can I come visit? See the shop? Anytime, I said. He came the following weekend. Spent 3 hours there. Asked Curtis more questions than I expected. Left quieter than he arrived. He called me 2 days later and said, I've been thinking about whether I could learn welding. Not as a job necessarily, but just to understand what you do. Would you teach me? I said yes. The postscript to all of this is the part people wouldn't believe if I told them. But I'll tell it anyway because it's true. 4 months after the wedding, Brendan reached out to me, not through Paige, directly by email. He said he'd been thinking about the conversation at the reception and he'd been doing some research. and he wondered if I'd be willing to meet for coffee because he had a question about commercial real estate development and whether structural fabrication contracting was a field where someone with a finance background could find a role. We met on a Thursday. He's a sharp kid, better than I initially gave him credit for, honestly. He'd done his reading. He asked good questions about margins, about how general contractors bid out specialty work, about what the liability exposure looked like on large structural contracts. At the end of the coffee, he said, "My dad was right about you." "What did your dad say?" I asked. "He said you were the most understated person he'd ever met, and that Paige didn't know how lucky she was." I finished my coffee. "She's figuring it out," I said. "The business is still running. We're in the middle of 2 contracts right now, one in Summit County and one in Stark. Curtis is talking about partnership, which I'm seriously considering. Phil says the books look better than they ever have. Diane and I had a real conversation about the company for the first time in 12 years. She's been asking questions I should have been answering years ago, and I've been answering them. It's not a perfect marriage, but it's a more honest one than it was 6 months ago. Paige and Brendan came for dinner last month. She brought a bottle of wine and helped set the table without being asked, which sounds like nothing, but if you knew Paige, you'd know what it meant. During dinner, Brendan asked me how I got into welding to begin with. Like he actually wanted to know. I told him about my first job out of high school, the summer I spent at a fabrication shop in Canton, making 30 cents above minimum wage and thinking I'd found what I was meant to do. He listened the whole way through. Paige was watching me while I told the story. When I finished, she said, "I never heard that story before." "You never asked," I said, but I smiled when I said it. She smiled back. "I'm asking now." So I told her. The whole thing, from that Canton shop to the garage in 2007 to the Medina distribution center. She listened. Really listened. Asked a question once or twice. When I finished, the table was quiet for a second. Then Marcus, who'd shown up an hour late, which is just Marcus, said, "I started my first welding class last Tuesday, by the way. The teacher says I have decent hands for it." Paige looked at him. "You're taking welding?" "Dad's teaching me on weekends," he said. We figured it was time I understood where the money actually came from. Everyone laughed. Even Diane. If you're watching this, I want you to know something. The people in your life will write a story about you if you let them. They'll decide what you are, what you're capable of, what your life amounts to. And they'll believe that story completely, because it's easier than asking. The only answer to that isn't confrontation. It isn't confrontation. It's just continuing to build. Build until the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Build until the question they never thought to ask answers itself. I'm Arthur Doyle. I'm a welder. I run a structural fabrication company with 11 employees and a very good foreman named Curtis. And for the first time in a long time, my family knows exactly who they're sitting at the table with. Let me know where you're watching from. And subscribe if you want to hear more. We're just getting started. I've been thinking about what actually happened that night. Not the dinner table moment, not the look on Paige's face when Douglas said the name of that distribution center out loud. What I keep coming back to is something quieter than all of that. For years, I let people fill in the blanks about me. And the thing about blanks is that people fill them with whatever makes their own story easier to tell. Paige needed a father who was background, so that's what she made me. Marcus needed someone he could feel a little sorry for, so that's the version he carried around. Even Diane, who loved me, and decided at some point that paying attention to what I built was optional. None of them were cruel people. They were just comfortable, and comfort, left unchecked, makes people lazy about the truth. What I did, and I want to be honest about this, wasn't some grand strategic plan. I didn't build Doyle Structural Services to teach my family a lesson. I built it because I loved the work and I was good at it, and I had the discipline to keep going when nobody was watching. That's the part that matters. The discipline to keep going when nobody is watching. Not for a reveal. Not for a moment. Just because the work itself was worth doing. The cause and the effect here aren't complicated. You treat someone like they're small long enough, and one of two things happens. Either they shrink or they grow somewhere you can't see. I grew in a shop in Stowe, Ohio, with Curtis beside me, and contracts on the wall, and a phone that rang because I'd earned the call. The effect of that, eventually, was a wedding reception where a cardiologist from Westerville said my company's name out loud, and my daughter set down her fork. Nobody handed me that moment. I accumulated it, year by year, shift by shift, invoice by invoice. That's what I want people to understand. Not that I was secretly rich, but that the work itself was the answer. The work I did before anyone respected it. The work I did when my daughter was telling her college friends I was between things. The work I kept doing anyway, because a man who stops building the moment people stop noticing was never really building for the right reasons. Paige asked me on that patio why I never said anything. I told her the truth. She never asked. But there's more to it than that. I also think, somewhere underneath all of it, I needed to know that I could do it without anyone's belief in me. I needed to find out what I was made of when the room was empty and the only person keeping score was me. That's not stubbornness. That's integrity in its most basic form. Doing the work because it's right, not because someone's watching. The lesson isn't keep secrets. The lesson is know yourself well enough that other people's stories about you don't become your story. Arthur Doyle the welder. Arthur Doyle the quietly struggling husband. Arthur Doyle who does industrial stuff. Those were their versions. I just kept building mine. And eventually, mine was the one that was still standing. If you're carrying something that nobody around you sees or values right now, I'm not going to tell you it'll all work out. I don't know your situation. But I know this. The gap between who people think you are and who you actually are. That gap is either filled with bitterness or with work. I chose work. It took 30 years. But I'd make the same choice again.